Okay, folks, we're going to have some fun now, because this is always exciting stuff. So what we're going to talk about is disclosures and consumer information in an age of borrower defensive repayment, which we've talked about some. There's going to be more later when Yolanda gets here. But the background on this, we've talked a little bit about it. Borrower defensive repayment regulations go into effect July 1st. And among the other things that are there, if you don't you have to look at your admissions process and make sure that you're not in a way that could be construed as being too pushy with students or being deceptive with students or any of those things. So it's important to document thoroughly all your conversations, but that's not what this is about. The other thing is there's a whole bunch of things you need to disclose. Many of them are policies. Many of them are just data. Some of them are just odd things, right? If you don't disclose those things, then the department believes that you are misrepresenting your school by not disclosing things like campus crime and a bunch of other things, right? So what has been rules for a very long time that schools of all types, not just little schools, not just big schools, all kinds of schools, have had a very difficult time keeping up with all of these rules and all of these things we have to disclose, right? So it becomes, after July 1st, critically important that you have all those disclosures wherever you're storing them. We're going to talk in a second about where do you want to put them and how do you want to disclose them, okay? We're going to first talk about policies, because I mentioned yesterday there's a whole bunch of written policies that you need to have. I was at a major university school a couple of weeks ago, and they handed me what was their financial aid policy and procedure manual, and it had like 3 of the 30 things it's supposed to have it, okay? So again, don't feel bad. I'm going to give you a comprehensive list, okay? But you need to have written policies for these things, okay? So you probably already have some of them. Some of them you're going to go, are you kidding me? I've never heard of that, okay? And of course, the department doesn't just give you a convenient checklist, because that would be too easy, and then they wouldn't be able to beat you over the head with a rock when they come out to see you, because you would go down the checklist and make sure you had them all, right? Some of those policies also flow into the disclosures because they need to be disclosed. Just off the top of my head, like return to Title IV policy, right? So those things need to be disclosed, and the question is, of course, well, how are we going to disclose it, right? So the disclosure audience, who do you have to disclose these things to? Well, for the most part, it's to any prospective student and any prospective employee for a lot of them, particularly like campus crime and those kind of things. And you have to disclose it at least annually to your continuing students. Now, many of you run programs, none of which last more than 12 months. So there are very few students ever that are there. If you disclosed it to them when they were signing up, they're not going to be there a year later, right? But you still have to disclose it to your employees annually, okay? So, again, as I said yesterday, there's a whole lot of information here. Some of it is ugly. Some of it is just boring. But nobody will read it anyway. Just make sure you have it and make sure you're disclosed it. Okay? So how are we going to disclose it? In our catalog? in a student handbook of some kind. I've seen schools that print out 30 pages of garbage and make somebody sign that they got it. My recommendation to you is your website, because it's a public place, it's open 24/7, and nobody can say, well, I didn't have access to it, or I didn't know. And again, the fact that it's out there doesn't mean anybody's going to read it. It just means if the department's planning to come look at you next week, when they go to your website, they're going to go, oh shit, everything's here. And they're going to be so surprised that everything's there. You would not believe what I see at four-year schools and universities and stuff where they have none of this stuff. So it's a real opportunity for you to set the right tone. If you've got you've got a policy and procedure manual, you've got all the disclosures on the website, when the feds come out, they're already thinking, boy, these people are on top of the game, you know? And I think it makes a big difference in their attitude for the whole week. It really does. I'll tell you a story about that. I built these policy and procedure manuals for schools, and we had a small school in New York City that was going through and just getting into financial aid. So we had built them this policy and procedure manual. We had trained their financial aid director. So 1 year in, the department comes out after you're in for a year, and they'll do a preliminary mini program review, if you will. So they come out to this New York City school. Now they're coming out of the New York office, so it's like they took the subway over there probably, or a taxi. It wasn't a big deal. The school was in Manhattan, right? So they come over, and the woman is scheduled to be there for 2 days to do her review. And she's looking at that policy manual, and she keeps asking the financial aid director, do you use this? She says, yeah, that's my Bible. That's how I operate. And she talked to her for a while. At lunchtime, she says, you guys are good. And she left. And she never came back. I know she took the afternoon and the next day off from work. But the point was, she was so impressed with the fact that they were so well organized that they had the stuff to be able to leave it on the table, you know, for her. That, you know, it set the whole tone for her, right? She figured for a school that's been in this 1 year, they really have their ducks in a row. So, and I would recommend to you, again, when we talk about this, putting as much of this on the website as we can, but also, now, some of the states and some of the creditors do have a specific list of things that must be in your catalog. Okay? So if you put them in your catalog, perhaps all you want to do on your public website for those things is just link to your catalog, which is also on your website, right? When you're building websites, just have it be catalog, not a year catalog. And then when you add a new catalog, it will just be the same name. Because I've seen that happen, okay? I go there and it's like, I click on the catalog on their website and it's the 1920 catalog. Because that's where everything's linking to, is that, right? And, you know, we're now on 3 years later and the one they're handing out is newer. So don't name it 1920 catalog, name it catalog every time. And then when you put a new one in, it'll replace the old one. But you got to be careful if you've got things in multiple places that they don't get updated on one and not the rest, or not the other, you know. So, and what happens often is, you know, it comes time for catalog, it's a new catalog, oh, we made a little tweak to this policy. It's now in the catalog, it's new, and it was also on the website as text, and nobody went back to the website and cut and paste the text in there, so now you've got two different policies. So it's something to be conscious of. And we're going to talk about how you control all this going forward too. So, all right. Written policies. there's many policies that are specifically required to be written policies. And among my list here, there's also some things that aren't specifically required in regulation to be a policy, but I don't know how the heck you could operate without having it. Okay? So some of the stuff you might be able to argue, Dave, that's not legally absolutely required. And you're probably right. But for the most part, 90% of them are. And the rest are functionally necessary. Okay? Let's talk about policy and procedure statements. Policies are mandated by the organization, by the school itself. These are things that the school is requiring themselves to do. Okay? A procedure is the how-to. And you can be as detailed and nitpicky in it as you want. If you want to sit there and write down all the steps and do that, you can. But the procedure is the how-to. Very rarely do we need to disclose our procedures, but we need to disclose our policies. So for example, we used R2T4, there's a policy, right? And it says, we calculate it according to the government methodology, we do it in this order, you know, blah, 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 blah. Well then the procedure might be much longer. It might include things like, okay, you go to this web address, you log in this way, you know, and as detailed as you feel is necessary. Now, if you've got experienced people, maybe they don't need those details. But if that person gets hit by a beer truck on the way to work tomorrow, the more detailed you are, the easier it is to train somebody and bring them up to take over, right? And some of these things you can outsource, but some of them you can't, right? So having how-to instructions is very valuable. I actually looked this up yesterday because it's a phrase I've used and I didn't know what it meant. It's actually from Shakespeare, Hamlet. What is it? Act 3, Scene 4. And I looked it up, and what it actually, I always thought it was like hoisted to be like hung, you know? And it's not. It literally means in Old English, blown up by your own bomb. So hoisted is blown into the air. Or, you know, as I sometimes say, run through with your own sword, okay? If you're going to have a darn policy, I try to keep my language, you know, but it doesn't always work. If you're going to have a darn policy, you darn well better be following it, okay? And I see this all the time too, because somebody wrote the policy 8 years ago. Nobody's looked at it since. And it's not what we're doing. In a lot of ways, that's worse than having no policy at all. Because you've actually, especially if it's a disclosed policy that's in your catalog or something like that, right? I see more schools get into trouble for not following their own policy than for not having a policy. And when you look at, you know, in larger organizations, what I always say is, the reason schools don't follow their SAP policy, for example, in larger organizations is because students cry. And people look at me, what are you talking about, Dave? Because they go to some professor or some dean who doesn't know anything about financial aid, and they cry and say, well, you know, it's so hard. All right, Susie, we'll give you another chance. We'll let you go another semester, right? And nobody followed the official procedure. Nobody filed an appeal. Nobody approved an appeal, but the kid's still in school, right? Have a policy, make sure everybody who's affected by that policy has read it, understands it, and understands that you're going to hit them over the head with a blunt instrument if they don't follow it. Maybe not even a blunt instrument, maybe a sharp instrument. Okay, let's talk about I've got a long list here of policies and disclosures, okay? You need a written policy that says who your capable individual is. The capable individual is the person who's responsible for financial aid. and for all aspects of financial aid regulation. That person cannot be in your business office. They cannot be a family member of anyone who is doing disbursements. Okay? You need a written policy on financial aid systems. You've got G5, you've got COD, and this will be available. I see some folks taking pictures. It's fine if you want to take pictures, but it will be available. I just sent it to Terry with my final edits, so he has it, and he will make it available to you if you ask him for it, if you email him. And you can email me too. You all got my business card. I'll send it to you. Access to financial aid systems. Who's going to be your data point administrator? Who has access to what? Obviously, we're not giving access to COD to business office people. We're not giving access to G5 to financial aid people, right? So, who has access to what? You need to have a policy. Otherwise, something weird will happen and you'll be in trouble. Enrollment status definitions. This is important. We need to define, okay, if you're a clock hour institution, how many hours are each of your programs? How many weeks are each of your programs? Because that defines your concept of academic year. You have to define academic year. You have to define your payment periods. You have to have definitions of all of these things. Well, where are you going to put them? Well, I got a memo from Susie, who was my previous boss, and it's in there. Let me see if I can find it. No, it should be in your policy and procedure manual. We talked about record retention yesterday. You need to have a record retention policy. And then say, well, what do you do with those records afterwards? You can say you destroyed them, even if you put them in a storage locker somewhere. You can say you deleted them from the computer to save space, even though you put them onto a hard drive and it's in the bottom drawer of your desk under lock and key. Okay? Institutional eligibility maintenance. This is about, well, for example, if you get a new chief financial officer or a new financial aid officer, a senior financial aid person, financial aid director, whatever you want to call them, you have 10 days from hiring that person to notify the department of their name and their contact information. Okay? You need to have a policy on that so that everybody knows that. And there's a whole list of things in there that you need to notify. If you want to add a program, if you want to add a location, even some more minor things than those. Okay? Cost of attendance creation. How do we create our cost of attendance every year? Because every year we got to create a cost of attendance, and we have to justify those numbers. You can't just pick out of a hat and say, well, I think the average rent in the area is... No, you have to have some logical justification for it. Okay? Academic progress for financial aid. One that must clearly be published. But you need to have a policy for it. Now remember, you're going to publish the policy, but you're not going to publish the procedure. Okay? Verification. For example, your verification policy must include a deadline and what the consequences are of the failure to meet that deadline. And that must be publicly disclosed. Conflicting information. We talked about this yesterday. How do you resolve that? It doesn't need to be a public thing, but you need to have a policy. And also, I keep those two things separate, because I used to do them in the same policy, but it tended to make people think that it was one thing. It's not one thing, it's two things, right? Packaging and awarding policy, particularly if you have SEOG or work study, you need to have a very specific policy as to how you award that, who you give it to. How do you make sure it's available to students who start later in the academic year? Federal origination and authorization process. Okay? Language is really important when the feds show up. Financial aid does not disperse aid. They authorize disbursement of aid. Okay? Even though they may be doing things like going into COD and flagging it ready for disperse, they are not actually dispersing, they are authorizing that to be dispersed. Okay? But How does the origination process work? Who's responsible? How do we, and you know, you get into, in the later part with the accounting, how do we reconcile that? How often do we reconcile it? Those kind of things. Professional judgment. You should see this stuff that I see, or that Greg sees. Professional judgment is not that hard, folks. It really isn't. But you can't make up your own set of rules. It's a judgment. It's different every time. You may come to the same conclusion every time, but it's a judgment every time. Okay? And this is what I see in professional judgment is our policy is we'll do it if you're this, 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 or this, but we won't do it if you're this, 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 or that. That's not a policy, a judgment. That's making up your own set of federal rules. And unless you're elected to Congress or the Department of Education, you shouldn't be making up your own rules. There is a rule that says you can override the rules by using good sense judgment. So that's the way you got to write that policy. Enrollment status reporting. How do we report through a third party or directly with NSLDS? How do we make sure the NSLDS record is complete and up to date? Because it's one of our responsibilities. Title IV fraud referrals we talked about yesterday. You need to have a policy which says, okay, you know, somebody's going to investigate it, somebody's going to bring that information to somebody, and that somebody's going to make the decision, which is often the president or whatever is going to make the final decision, right? Electronic processes in federal reporting. We talked yesterday about how you must use the electronic processes, but also what are the federal reports? What are the due dates? Who's responsible? Okay? Default management, financial literacy. If you have a default management plan other than the federal plan, this is where you would attach it. What you're doing for default management, what you're doing to help your students develop some sort of concept that a loan is something they're supposed to pay back, because apparently we don't teach that in English class in high school anymore. So, we need to make sure they understand their responsibilities, but also give them a place they can go. Maybe it's on your website, which we'll talk to in a minute. Some web resources for learning how to manage their personal finance. Okay. Admissions criteria and process. One of the biggest things I see is you got all this in standard in your catalog that says this is who will admit. And then I talk to somebody, well, we can't admit him because he doesn't have this. Where is it in your catalog? Because you're going to be sued for discrimination, right? Or the opposite, right? It says in your catalog you must have a high school diploma, blah, 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 blah. But I've got 6 kids. Well, they're not getting financial aid, so it's okay. No. You said you had to have a high school diploma to get in. That's misrepresentation if I'm in class with people who don't have one, right? Admissions consumer disclosures. How are we disclosing all this information we're talking about in a minute, this consumer disclosures? How are we actually disclosing those to students? Because in addition to putting it all on the website, you might want to have, and I usually will recommend to folks that they have a one-page document as part of the admissions process that says, I understand it's important that I read the catalog and the website thoroughly. Okay? And it oftentimes will mention some of the specific disclosures in there. And they have them sign that, right? Just so they got a one-page document that says, we told them they were supposed to read the catalog. I can't make them sign that they did read the catalog, because then I'm misrepresenting, because I know damn well they didn't, right? But making them promise to read the catalog and read the website. Will they? They promised to. Okay. Separation of function, checks and balances. We talked about this. Again, if you're expecting people to follow a policy, you got to have a policy. And it's got to say who's responsible for what. And we don't want to put individuals who may be very honest individuals into a conflicted situation. And that's the reason we talk about admissions and separation for financial aid, is because that admissions person's job is obviously judged on whether they're enrolling people. And if they're getting desperate and the boss is coming down on them and they're not doing a very good job, and you're letting them have access to influence financial aid, at the point their desperation crosses a certain threshold, they might be inclined to do something dishonest in order to encourage more people to come so they don't lose their job, right? So that's why we build those checks and balances in, so that people aren't in a position where they're under a conflict of interest.
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
Earlier you said that financial aid not in some office?
No, I didn't say that at
I
all.
thought that's what you
No. In fact, at bigger schools, I often recommend that they split their financial aid staff into those that serve new students and those that serve continuing students. In fact, many times the financial aid office, even in medium-sized schools, will have a person who's dedicated to admissions, and I think it's a good idea for them to physically be with the admissions folks. Yeah, but one of the things, and I'm off on a tangent, but I think it's important, that doesn't mean they answer to the director of admissions. They still answer back to the financial aid person, who's the capable individual, way at the beginning. Make that clear in your org chart and in your policies, right? But what I like to say is, I'm 59 years old, okay? I'm of a different generation. I'm not a baby boomer, but I'm too old to be really a Gen X, so I'm like in the middle. But I'll tell you, people my age, when we had a problem, we didn't let anything stop us. We just figured out how to get around it, and we went and did it. Now you've got a second generation in a row that seems incapable of stepping over this wire, okay? Oh my goodness, it's such an obstacle. What am I going to do? It's all the way around. I can't get out. I'm trapped. So, on the admissions process, I would advise you to think about that. And think about the nature of the people we're dealing with. And don't have them spend an hour with an admissions person who has become their mentor and their friend and has worked hard to be that person who helps them over these things. Got them to love the school, got them to realize that, to visualize themselves in the uniform, right? And they love it. And then we tell them, well, go sit in this chair and wait for an hour for Susie from financial aid, who's a total stranger. And these kids have the social skills of a gnat. And are scared to death of strangers, even though Susie's like 5 foot nothing and 75 pounds, right? But they're scared to death of strangers. And then when they finally get to Susie, Susie's like, were you born before January 1st? Okay? I would strongly recommend to you that you pick someone other than Susie with the no interpersonal skills, and someone who can work closely with admissions and bring them right into the admissions person's office so you can have a 3-person conversation. Because Susie, no matter how good she is at financial aid, is not there and trained to handle objections and to keep people on track, right? And also, and I'm getting off on a tangent, but I think it's valuable to you. Also, when Susie comes into the office, if those of you who know a little bit about financial aid know, if I'm the admissions person and I know a little bit about financial aid, I can say to you, oh, this is Susie, she's interested in nursing. Susie's 22 years old, she's not married, she's got a couple kids, she lives on her own. And she used to work at such and such, but she just lost her job. What do I know? I know she's going to be full pal. I know she's independent. I got her package already done. Right? And I didn't have to ask her if she was born before January 1st or if she's a veteran of the armed forces. You know, I didn't have to be the motor vehicles office. All you had to do so I call that the warm handoff. And I think it's becoming even more critical in an era of BDR. Having those 3 people in the same room gives you 2 people who can testify, no, we didn't pressure him. Where are we here? Ethics, code of conduct. If you use any type of loans other than the federal direct student loans, parent loans, you need to have a student loan code of conduct, okay, which prohibits you from any of your employees from having too cozy a relationship with a private lender, okay? Communications, but it's still good to have an ethics policy even if that's not the case. Communications to the financial aid office. We talked about this yesterday. You need to have a policy for how that information gets back to financial aid when we have a circumstance where someone may be, we may have conflicting information about their eligibility, right? You may have state-specific requirements. Almost every state does. Texas seems to be particularly bad. Your accreditor may have very specific requirements, okay? Good to have a list of those and remind people why we do things. Like you go to a Texas school, you know, there's a very specific refund policy, right? Some states don't have that. You go to an ACCSC school, there's a thing posted in everybody's office about how to file a complaint with the accreditor. Because if nobody remembers why we put it up, somebody will take it down. Consumer Information Disclosure Policy, good idea. FERPA GLBA Privacy Policy. Okay, I find most people know about FERPA. A lot of people don't know about the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Okay? The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act is the privacy policy for financial institutions, and since we give out student loans, it applies to schools as well. Okay? This is why you get that privacy policy from your bank. We used to get the little thing in your bill once a year. Well, now it's once a year when you sign on. It says you cannot go forward today until you accept our privacy policy. And then you lie and say that you've read it and check the box. We need to have one of those for our schools. And it has some very specific things, including how do we safeguard information, like we never send personal information via email, because that's like putting it on a postcard. Okay? Those kind of things. Campus Security Act. If you do not have at least a 10-page document on your website called the Annual Security Report, you are not in compliance with this. This is huge. It's not just the crime stats. It's Violence Against Women Act. It's what we do about date rape and sexual assault. Even though we're not open at night and we don't have dormitories, we still got to have a policy. You know, it would take me all afternoon to go through it. I have an entire hour presentation on it.
So campus security would be separate then from the Clery Act?
No, the Clery Act requires you to have something called an annual security report that you distribute to students. And in that regulation, the things you must disclose include the violence against women, your drug and alcohol policy. So those all are part of this.
And that's in our catalog.
You could have it in your catalog if you want, but the timing on your catalog has to then match up with the timing on this, because this has a very specific time frame it must be updated.
But we get the campus report yearly. So now we need to do something about Clery Act yearly too?
Clery Act is the act that enacted the campus security rules. It's just it is the law.
We just got our first Clery bill. What was it? Last meeting or the meeting before? We got not here this year. What's his name? They did the class.
Oh, I don't remember.
What was the class, Linda, that we took that he's not here this year? Because we got to go online and do it.
No. You do have to report the statistics online. That's part of it. But you also have to have this long disclosure that you tell the students, okay, what is our Title IX policy? What do you do if you feel you're the victim of sexual discrimination? It needs to all be in that annual security report and disclosed. And I would recommend you keep it on the website because it needs to be updated at different times of the year than your catalog. And if you need to update it in June and then update it again in August, it's as simple as updating it on the website, not printing a new document, right? Okay. Title IX and anti-discrimination. Title IX ties into the Clery Act because it requires you to disclose certain things about it. But you need to have an anti-discrimination statement in your catalog, which you probably already do. I often encourage schools to incorporate all discrimination accusations into their Title IX office. Because if you built this for people to bring their allegations of sexual discrimination, you may as well use the same vehicle for any other kind of discrimination claims. And you need to thoroughly investigate them, and sometimes they're legit and sometimes they're not. But, you know, you need to have a policy for that. Who's responsible? How does it work? Who do they report to? Drug and alcohol policy. Also, under the Drug-Free Schools and Workplaces Act, you need to have a drug and alcohol policy for your staff as well as for the students. And it theoretically might not be the same. A story I tell is I have a school here in Texas, and I was down visiting, and they had just gotten word that a recently retired instructor had just passed. And of course, all the other instructors knew him, and so the president and owner had gone out and bought a nice bottle of whiskey, and they were all going to drink a toast, you know, in the afternoon to this guy who had just passed. So he says, "So go hide because I know I'm violating the drug and alcohol policy." I said, "No, you're not." I said, "I got you covered." Because in his drug and alcohol policy, it says, except for special events approved by the president or one of the vice presidents, right? Where only adults are served, right? Legal adults are served, right? So again, it's a case of, if I hadn't had that in that policy, he would be violating his own policy. So you don't want to be hoisted on your own petard, right? It's important that we not only have these policies, but that we look at them and we update them and we make sure that they make sense for us. Refunds, we mentioned return to Title IV. Refunds, a lot of times that's a state mandated policy. If it's not, good, keep it simple. You know, don't go crazy. Title IV disbursements. How do disbursements happen? Okay? Because now I've authorized them in COD, then what happens? Okay? What does somebody do in G5? How does that information of who those people are get over there and who does the reconciliation, right? Federal cash management. Crazy stuff like, got to have a separate bank account. It has to be labeled federal funds. How do we handle excess cash? How do we handle when we're doing a refund? How do we handle getting that money back, right? Some of it's more procedural. Let's talk about consumer disclosures. Our accreditation person over here is going, my God, I'm glad I'm in the accreditation side, not the financial. And this is important because this is not new with the BDR, but it is more effective with the BDR. The common meaning of always to us of misrepresentation was an intent to deceive, right? You intended to deceive. Well, a few years back, they changed the regulations to say, well, no, it's not just an intent to deceive. It's if you didn't give them all the information they needed to make a good decision to come to your school or to stay at your school, then you have deceived them. Therefore, all of this consumer information stuff we have to have becomes important. What BDR does, in my view, is just made every student an arbiter of that. Every student can say, well, in my opinion, they didn't give me all the information, and go to the department who's going to take their side 99% of the time and say, so we need to be able to say, this is what's on my website, look at it all. Go look, it's all there, right? And oh, by the way, here's the signed document where the student promised to read that before he started school. So when I build a consumer information policy for someone, which is kind of an overview of it, I list all of these things and I talk about where we're going to disclose them. Okay, so general information about the school, our address, that kind of stuff. How long we've been in business, those kind of things. That's all in your catalog. Nature, that's probably also on your website. Nature of your educational programs. Well, what do we teach? How long are the programs, right? Financial aid information. Information about the programs, including one of the things we must disclose to students or provide to students is what is the maximum amount of a Pell Grant this year? Changes every year. So what I always do with that is within the text, I link them to the Department of Ed's Pell Grant website. Because if they don't update their website, it's not my fault. How to apply instructions, and that includes how to do their master promissory note. Okay, so I put in some basic instructions and then a link to the feds. So here's where you go to do it, right? And there's instructions there as well, right? But these are things we're missing. Cost of attendance. What is our cost? What is our cost of attendance? It must be disclosed. Now, in some cases, you may have your physical costs in the catalog, but you must also disclose the cost of attendance figure. Not that a student at all, unless their parent, one of their parents is in the financial aid biz, knows what that means. But we have to give it away, right? We have to give that information out. A net price calculator is essentially an online estimator that estimates, based upon your costs a year and a half ago, what an average person would get in financial aid based upon their financial condition. So they fill out a very vague approximation of the FAFSA, and it kicks out a very vague approximation of what their package would look like, or would have looked like a year and a half ago, before Pell Grants went up and before your prices went up and everything else, right? A dumb idea that somebody put in for their political point of view that never got taken out. If you use the federal one, it sucks, but it meets the criteria. My problem with the federal one is, even at a community college that has very, very low tuition, the way it figures and the way it calculates still makes it look like you can't afford it. So the good news is nobody looks for these and nobody actually looks at it. But there are, including a product we have, there are some things that aren't so bad. Some of them are very expensive, some of them are more reasonable, but you need to have one type or another. Loan counseling requirements. This is a disclosure you must disclose to students, that they must do an entrance counseling, you must do an exit counseling. I'm so old I still say entrance interview, I'm sorry. Because when I went to school you actually had to go to the bank and they actually had to talk to you. Which I don't think was a bad idea. Refund return to Title IV must be disclosed. Now, again, a lot of times those are in your catalog. And sometimes your state or your creditor will require them to be in your catalog. So make sure that if you're going to post them also to your website that they're the same. Or just where you're putting that in your website, just give them a link to the catalog and tell them what page it's on. Financial literacy. We're supposed to doing efforts toward financial literacy for students. And how do we fit that into a short program that might only last 7.5 months, right? How do we make that part of the curriculum? And we really don't have time to do that. So one of the ways you can effectively do that is to create a web page that has links to there's a lot of consumer resources out there. And a nice little narrative explains some things to them and gives them some places they can go to learn more about how to manage their money. using the computer to take that off your burden, your list of things to do. Student Right to Know Act. This is your graduation rates. And they're always 2-3 years old because that's the way it works. But these are also disclosed now through, what do they call it now? They keep changing the names of things and I can't remember what it is. It used to be the College Navigator, now it's whatever. Your annual security report, we talked about that. It should be at least 10 pages long or you don't have everything in it. And that, I'm talking on a Word document. Drug and alcohol policy we talked about, you need to disclose it. Student loan code of conduct, you need to disclose it. Privacy policy, you need to disclose it. Copyright infringement, you must have a policy that prohibits kids from using your computer to use Napster. Napster's been out of business for 20 years, but nobody ever cleaned out the old regulation. So you need to have a policy and disclose it that says it's against the rules to use our computers for peer-to-peer file sharing and for illegal download of copyrighted material. Generally, when I write these for schools, I stick it in their catalog or on their website, and I blend it in with their, if they have a policy that prohibits students from doing those same things as far as academic integrity. Because if you're writing a paper or something, you can't just steal somebody else's stuff. Now they'll just, have a computer write it for them. Written agreements. If you have a written agreement with any other institution that provides instruction for your students or you for theirs, you need to disclose that you have such an agreement and what the essence of it is. You don't have to give them a copy. But if, for example, you're a school and you have a short part of your program that's taught by the community college, that's great. You just need to disclose that to say a short part of this program is taught by the community college and you will need to attend over there or their instructors will come here, whatever. So if you're doing something like that, you just need to disclose it. Thankfully, none of us have athletics, right? Good. Fire safety policies only applies to schools with dormitories. Citizenship, voter registration. We're supposed to talk to them about citizenship as part of this and Constitution Day. We're also supposed to provide them an application to apply to vote in our state. Okay? Again, can be done completely through the website with a page on citizenship, voting, and Constitution Day. Okay? And you go into that, in that web page, you have a link to wherever you can apply online in your state to vote. Right? Because every state has it now that you can submit an online application to vote. And you know why that one's there? You know why that one's there, right?
What, the voter registration?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I hand it to everybody that walks in the voter cards.
Well, you don't have to.
I didn't know it was online.
What state you're in, Texas?
Texas?
Yeah, there's a government website you can sign up online.
Yes, I will be doing that from now on.
What's the citizenship? What do we have to do with that?
Mostly it's just Constitution Day, or, you put a little bit of that kind of spin on it. But wait, what? What are you talking about, Dave? A whole bunch of other stuff that isn't necessarily disclosures, but maybe Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, Regulation Z. If you have a payment plan that extends longer than the program, or charges interest, it is not a payment plan. It is an education loan, and therefore subjects you to all the regulations regarding a student loan, an education loan, which makes you a bank, and that there are sometimes it ain't worth doing it yourself, and this is one of them, okay? There are a dozen various companies that will manage this for you, who will make sure that all of the proper forms are filled out and they have all the proper wording in them and all of that stuff. Taxpayer Relief Act is what causes you to have to issue a 1098-T. Okay, if you're in financial aid, you must issue every year to your students from the prior year a 1098-T, which shows the tuition that they paid minus whatever aid they got, so that their parents or the student can deduct that from their taxes. Red flag statute goes with Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. There are certain things you should not do that are red flags for privacy. Drug-free schools and workplaces we talked about. Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act we talked about. I don't even remember why it's in there, but it's in there for a reason. This is how crazy it is. This is what I do, but it's just gotten so insane. I mean, Constitution Day, voter registration, the anti-piracy electronic countermeasures is what we just talked about with the Napster thing. Quality assurance program for DL. Most of the schools in the country don't realize you're supposed to have an internal policy for how you do a internal quality assurance audit once a year of the quality of how you're handling the direct loan program. Now, part of that can be your accounting audit, but part of it, you should have a written policy that says that's part of it and how else we do it. Like for my schools, we've written into the policy that I come out, or one of my folks comes out once a year, and we'll perform that as part of our annual review. We'll look at how they handle the direct loan program. Of course, we would do that anyway, right? But then when I submit the report, within the report I say, you know, also we've done this as part of your quality control activity. I'm getting close to the end, Terry. Oh, good. Every time I see him, I think, he's got to bring that stupid thing in here. Okay, and a dozen other stupid things. So one of the things we got to think about is who's responsible. We kind of need a policy to say who's responsible for all these policies and disclosures. And if you're the owner and you want it to be you, that's fine. But we need somebody who's going to coordinate this. And it's actually easier for you in some ways than it is for the bigger schools. Because I go to the big universities and these departments are in different buildings. They don't even talk to each other. And then you expect a financial aid officer to go over and talk to the dean and say, well, you need to revise these policies, or you need to, you know, and they're like, you know, we're not doing any of that, right? So it's actually somewhat easier for us to do this, right? But who will create the policies? Some of these policies, and again, some of the disclosures and some of the policies have very specific time frames in which they must be reviewed and updated if necessary. For example, your campus security policy, I think the drug and alcohol, I've got it all written down, right? But all of these policies, a lot of them have a time frame that says every 2 years you must review them, and if you need to update them, update them. Well, you got to document that. You're all accredited schools, right? If you're in financial aid, so you understand. Same as with the accreditor. If there's a meeting, there should be minutes that are kept somewhere. That should be in a policy. Who keeps those minutes? Or who do we give them to keep them? So that when the feds come in or the accreditor comes in, we can say, well, here's the meeting of the minutes where we got together and we looked at the campus security policy and thought it was pretty good, and we decided we didn't need to update it. Okay? And who will handle the annual disclosures? Now, the annual disclosures can be handled through an email. If you have everyone's email and you have a system to send them an email, you can send an email, you can send the same one to your employees and everything else, and if you've got all the stuff on the website, you can actually provide some direct links to it within the email and say, as a reminder of and specifically you have to list the annual security report and some other things, but you can put direct links to them so that, you know, when anybody gets that email, they can click on it and read it. Will they? No. But then you've got a copy of it because you sent it to yourself as well, right? And you archive that. I recommend printing it out and putting where you put the minutes, right? And as I've asked a few times, is your financial aid director really the best person to be that? You know, and maybe they are, maybe they're not. I don't know your personality, right? Now, remember this from the very beginning of the presentation. Borrower defensive repayment, right? But don't worry. You have the lawyer over there chasing the ambulance. But I say this only half in jest, right? You need to cover yourself, you know, and Yolanda's going to talk more. She is coming soon? Oh, there she is. Hi, I haven't seen you in so long. She's going to talk more about that, but you need to prepare yourself to defend your innocence, because it's that bad. And we hope that some court will decide that it's not fair, that it's improper to make people guilty until they prove themselves innocent. But until that happens, we've got to be prepared as best as possible to prove ourselves innocent. And that means when you've got all this stuff on your website, you've got all this stuff in your catalog to be able to say, oh, by the way, here's a list of all the things we have on our, and here's a list, and here's our policy on who updates it. I may be able to help you with this, and this is my 30-second advertisement. We're working on creating a computer system that will create all of the policy and procedure manual and all of the website materials for you to do all of this. The third thing it does, it will create a policy and procedure manual that you can print out and have in a nice printed form or just see internally. It is not ready yet, so if you go to the website right now, there ain't anything there. Okay, so it will create the websites for you, your consumer information and financial aid information websites. They will actually reside on our system. You will just put one line of code in your website, and it will visually appear as if it's on your website. So if anybody clicks it, you can put in your school colors in there and your school fonts and those kind of things so it matches. And the third thing it does, you're the school owner, right? The third thing it does is this. It keeps track of all the things that you have to do throughout the year and every other year. It has a calendar in it that will send an email to the person who's responsible for doing it and to the boss and say, this is what you need to do by January 30th. It's now January 10th or whatever, and you know, for different things, different timelines. It will tell you, this is what you need to do by then. You know, you're going to do your January reconciliations for your federal funds, right? And once that is, it'll send that email to both the person and their boss. Once it is done, that person can go back to that email, click on a link in it, and flag it as done. And then the boss will get another email that says, your employee has flagged it as done. Okay? But you know there's things that have to happen every month, there's things that happen every year. Those things that happen every year are all at different times. You know some of these policies need to be reviewed every 2 years. So it will handle all of that. It will deluge you with a bunch of emails, but I think it will let the boss know if something's not happening, which, you know, you don't want to find out later you missed a federal deadline. Right? And the only thing I can't prevent is your employees from lying and saying they did it when they didn't, but you'll probably figure that out pretty quick. So, like I said, we are hoping to be live. The computer guy promised me we'd be live by the middle of May, probably early June. You have my card and stuff. If you're interested in it, you can give me a few more weeks and I'll be able to tell you a more definite date. Oh, and by the way, it does say on the brochure what we're planning to charge is $249 a month. And it'll be constantly updated. If any of the rules change, we will update it. Yeah, well, and part of it was to have me come in and do this all individually for you can be very expensive for a small school. So some of the small schools have said to me, what can I get that I can afford? So that's really where we came up with the idea. And it is very, very complex. The setup's going to take some time. The setups, we're figuring to take 4 to 5 hours with you on the phone or on a web meeting with us. Just filling in all the details. Who's this, who does that, how long's your programs? There's just a plethora of details in there. But once we got all the details in there, then anything that changes in the text will automatically update. And you have the option, if you have a very specific policy for something like SAT, you don't like the generic one that's in there, you can cut and paste and put your own over the top. Of course, that won't update when I do updates, right? So, other than that, my favorite band is the Moody Blues, so I'll end you with, why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door? Any questions? Thoughts?
I have a question. Are you planning on having it in Spanish? Are you planning to have it in Spanish?
I would have to get enough schools to make it worth my while to do that. However, I have worked with schools in Puerto Rico before. And if it's of value to you, perhaps we could. Perhaps we could if the first school would help us do all the translations. Because I do have an occasional consultant, part-timer, who's a full-time financial aid director down in Florida, a friend of mine for 30 years, and he's Puerto Rican, but his grammar isn't so good. Well, he was raised in New Jersey, so I mean, he spoke to his grandparents. So
he's a New Yorker.
Yeah, he never went to school. He never went to school for Spanish in Puerto Rico. Anything else? Great, guys. Thank you very much. I hope you had a little fun.